A woman named Mia wrote an article for Christianity Today. She said we need to be quick to listen and slow to therapy speak.
Oh, not what I was expecting.
Yeah, because the Bible just says be quick to listen and slow to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what she writes. I was going through a breakup when I started therapy post-pandemic. My friends were telling me that I needed to work on healthier emotional boundaries. They said I was probably experiencing trauma from a toxic ex. Most likely, I'd been in a codependent relationship.
Wow. Buzzwords.
Well, yes. However, I think for some it's become just like regular speak, not buzz, just normal. So she said, when I went to fill out the intake questionnaire before my first appointment, I regurgitated what I'd heard. I was seeking therapy to, quote, establish healthier emotional boundaries because of a codependent relationship that had left me traumatized. Are you laughing at her? Lauren?
Yes.
Self-diagnosis is a real problem in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she wrote that on her intake form.
I bet her counselor was like, how about you let me tell you?
Why are you coming to therapy? Let's see. I'm establishing healthier emotional boundaries because of a codependent relationship that left me traumatized. She said, but after a few sterile sessions full of the jargon I'd picked up from friends on the internet, I stopped using these terms. Trauma, codependence, emotional boundaries. I was using language to distance myself from reality. I was confusing self-preservation for emotional maturity. And she said, it's not like these words were entirely inaccurate. It's that they've become cliches, shorthand that kept me from understanding the nuances of my own experience. So these have become buzzwords. Many of us have used it. We've used them on the show.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to think about these differently? Like, how do we need to use the scriptures to think about these buzzwords differently? We'll go over that together and some of her discoveries on this from a Christianity Today article. Okay, so if you're just tuning in as well, we've been chatting about an article from Christianity Today that we need to be quick to listen and slow to therapy speak. And a woman describes how her friends told her she experienced trauma after a breakup, so she had become codependent to her toxic ex and filled out an intake form for a therapist saying all those things. But apparently she's not alone, she says, in her use of therapy speak. Thanks to social media, terms once confined to clinical settings are ubiquitous in everyday conversation. A difficult roommate is toxic. Conflict is abuse. Every ex-boyfriend is a narcissist. And stress is always trauma. And we're all victims. And by the way, we've all been gaslit.
Yeah.
We use
Sounds
these
about
terms
right.
a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think she rightfully points out, she says, sometimes, of course, these words are warranted. With mental illness on the rise, it's helpful to have common language at our disposal. As more people discuss their mental health, therapy itself is becoming destigmatized. And this is very good, she says. Now, because I know behind the scenes, we've talked about issues in life or whatever. There have been times I know people have been gaslit.
Mm-hmm.
I've been gaslit before. If you don't know, it's the idea that, like, let's just say Ron and I go to the store, and the next day I go, hey, wasn't that fun going to the store? And Ron goes, you didn't go to the store with me. We didn't go to the store. What are you talking about? Like, that's being gaslit. He's totally pretending that reality is not reality, trying to make you feel crazy. And trauma does exist, and so does abuse, but we're using these words too much, she says. So, but all of us, and Christians in particular, should be careful about over-relying on therapy speak to describe our relationships with others. This language has consequences, not only for understanding our own lives rightly, but for living together as a body of Christ. How we speak shapes what we do, and therapy speak might be limiting our ability to love our neighbors well. Overusing therapy speak, or using it out of context, conflates different kinds of difficult experiences. That conflation can be confusing at best and harmful at worst. And so what she goes on to say is that this can be an excuse to selfishly draw boundaries that aren't necessary, and it discourages introspection. Like when we suddenly use therapy speak to blame someone else, like her ex-boyfriend, she's not doing any introspection and not gaining any sort of self-awareness of her own contributions to a bad relationship. And therefore, she says the Christian life itself is designed to be messy. And so if we're overusing therapy speak, we're actually shutting down relationships that are designed to help us grow. Is this woman nutty?
Just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking with Dr. Gersovich on how we have so common, like mental illness is so common and so accepted, which is, it's a good thing that it's been destigmatized. The problem is we talk about it so much that people sit around self-analyzing themselves all day and diagnosing themselves with things that they probably don't have. And I see this kind of going hand in hand with that.
And, she says here that for Christians, the community is eternal. It's also messy. In Life Together, Dietrich Bonhoeffer recognized that through hard relationships, we realize how much we need God's grace. And I could give you a quote from Bonhoeffer, but it's sometimes difficult to digest. He's like a Tozer to me sometimes. But he actually ended up creating his community in Germany of people who literally lived together in a large estate and did the difficult work that it takes relationally to live life together and try to grow closer to Jesus.
Wow.
And that in today's society, they'd all have moved out because the other person's toxic.
Because they left their trash on the counter.
Right. And that's abusive or gaslighting. Or my kids do it to me every day. Whose stuff is this? Nobody's. Whose bowl is this? Well, it's not mine. It's not your mother's. It's one of yours. No, it's not. It's not mine. Okay. I'm being gaslit. But
you can't kick your kids out because most of them are still minors.
Right. She says therapy speak just might be making us less patient, less kind, and less generous, slower to forgive and quicker to anger. Our culture too easily tosses people aside over difficulties that are converted into trauma or toxicity. We limit the fruit that comes from living together. We turn sacrificial love into a burden. So the question to me becomes then, how do you draw a line? Because she's saying real trauma does exist. Real gaslighting does exist. So does abuse. And you do need to set healthy boundaries. But you can't just suddenly take anything that makes you uncomfortable and turn it into trauma and cut people off, which is what's happening now.
I think it's hard because you're analyzing the people outside of yourself using these types of words, but you also need those people to speak into your life to tell you if that's actually true. You need other people to speak for your experience too.
Yeah.
To say like, yeah, what you are going through is abuse. Someone is abusing you. Or yes, that person is narcissistic. I do see it also. Instead of just, claiming it for yourself.
But I mean, yes, here's where I can push back a little. We all contain some measure of narcissism.
Sure.
Because we're all sinners, right? And so it has to be pretty extreme to cut someone off, doesn't it?
Should be.
Yeah.
And so how much narcissism can we accept in our lives from someone else?
I think you need to let people that are wiser and more mature to you speak into these issues, like a therapist or someone else you trust, not one of your peers. Because I've spoken to this before. People in my generation are very quick to cut off their families, and it's not always warranted. So if you think that is something that would be good for you and necessary, get a second opinion about it.
And quite frankly, you may need to get therapy to help make that decision. So a professional who's a third party, not emotionally connected to you, who isn't just cheering for you, can give you a fair evaluation of what you're experiencing. But instead, what they might do, though, you might be surprised to find out they teach you some coping strategies and some ways to set boundaries for yourself and maintain a relationship.
Yeah, because some people are not necessarily pleasant people that you want around all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to completely cut them out.
And if someone if someone in your life actually does have narcissistic personality disorder, that they need help too.
Right.
Like that's a mental health issue. And so then they just don't get to have anybody in their lives. I don't think that's what Jesus calls us to. I think he calls us to live life with people and work it out with people. Living life with people isn't easy.
No, and I don't think he intended it to be if he told us to love our enemies.
Right.
It's so easy to forget that command. You kind of go to yourself, I didn't really mean that, not this person.
Right. So, so if someone is actually narcissistic, like clinically, they deserve to have people in their life too.
To love them.
To love them and to bear with them. And maybe God's calling you to that. Or he's equipped you to do that.
And except, though, that what I would say is as long as it's not from a position of self-righteousness.
Right.
This is where we have to consistently preach the gospel to ourselves. And this was the key, I think, to what she said, is that when you quickly take some buzzwords and you label them from someone else, stops you immediately from introspection.
Right.
Yeah. I like that she said it's like all self-preservation. Like she's only doing all these things to protect herself. And she has no thought otherwise for other people in her life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm fairly convinced, you can help me with this, that if I'm in a conflict, it's almost never, if not never, 100% someone else's fault.
Right.
Yeah. Almost always there's two parts to it, if not more.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, there could be multiple layers, but goodness gracious. I mean, it still might be, like 80% their fault, but I need to spend some serious time in my 20.
Yeah.
And I need to be ready to, even though it may not feel fair,
because their portion is so much larger.
I need to be the one that's owning it and repenting of it. That's how you live out the gospel. You can go to somebody with true repentance, which we're going to talk about that later today, what that really looks like.
Okay.
And own it and be sorry and turn from your sin with full sincerity. And that's the hard part.
Yeah.
It's self-righteousness, I think, that ends up wrecking everything.
And sometimes your strongest relationships start or at some point have this kind of a conflict within it. And you have to work through the conflict, and then you have the strong relationship on the other side.
Right.
But if you just jettison your friend and say, oh, he's toxic, out of here, then you won't have any deep friendships.
Yeah, and we've talked recently with some of our older kids about relational conflict, and they'll talk about something that's bothering them with a friend or whatever. And we'll be like, yeah, your mom and I didn't figure that one out till well after we were married. Like, we didn't just get it all figured out and then get married.
Right.
We've had to, as you say, we've gotten closer because of the endurance through the conflict.
Right. It's a marvel Dana kept me around.
Preach, brother. Not about you, but about myself.
Right.
But perhaps that's why God designed it as a covenant, because he knew that's how we would grow. It would force us to grow. Not that friendships have to be covenants like that, but maybe we treat them more like that. Church community. It's going to be messy. So buckle up,
People are messy. You're messy too. We're all messy.
I'm messy in both senses of the word. Stop enjoying that so much. Team.